Now 107 years old, the Ford manufacturing plant along the River Rouge was once the largest integrated factory in the world. The plant has been used to produce 28 different car models and is still in use today, producing aluminum bodies for the Ford F-150. The plant played a central role in the development of American manufacturing. But little remembered today is that the plant wasn't originally built to make cars, but rather to build ships for the U.S. Navy. The Ford Eagle patrol boats deserve to be remembered.
In December of 1917, Ira E. Bennett, editor of the Washington Post, described a harrowing situation. Reports from the submarine war zone show that ruthless destruction is going on. The Allies are losing thousands of tons of shipping and untold millions in values in merchandise, not counting the loss of lives and handicaps that are imposed upon the Allied armies on account of delay of receiving indispensable munitions. Bennett made a clear argument. The U.S. needed to do more than just build more merchant vessels to make up for losses. They had to build ships to defend those vessels from German submarines. There must be something created to kill off submarines, to grapple with this slimy and lurking foe and strangle it. His suggestion: the crying need of this hour is an eagle that will scour the seas and pounce upon and destroy every submarine that dares to leave German or Belgian shores. In his editorial, Bennett realized something that was also a concern for the Navy. The U.S. was building destroyers, but they took too long and were too expensive. Something new was needed, something Bennett argued derived from the inventive genius of the United States to combat the U-boats. The Navy did have one solution. Deliveries of the SC-1 class submarine chaser had started in July of 1917. The boats were built by yacht builders on the East Coast, thus minimizing impact on other shipbuilding efforts. 110 foot long, the submarine chasers mounted a single 3-inch naval gun and a Y gun for the new depth charges. But the wooden hulled boats were too small and had too short a range, making them really only suitable for coastal patrols. The Navy, and particularly the Undersecretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt, realized they needed something with a better operational range, but which could be completed more quickly than a destroyer. So the president appealed to one of the nation's most well-known inventive geniuses. We had, up to the time of the declaration of war, absolutely refused to take war orders from the foreign belligerents, Henry Ford wrote in his 1922 autobiography, My Life and Work. It is entirely out of keeping with the principles of our business to disturb the routine of our production unless in an emergency. It is at variance with our human principles to aid either side in a war in which our country was not involved. But these principles had no application once the United States entered the war. Once we were in the war, every facility of the Ford Industries was put at the disposal of the government. These facilities would do quite a lot. Ford built some 30,000 vehicles for the war effort. Of course, they produced their regular production cars and parts and special delivery trucks and ambulances for the military, but they also built what Ford described as many other articles that were more or less new to us, including 2-ton and 6-ton trucks. Ford produced nearly 4,000 Liberty engines for airplanes, caissons for artillery pieces, and more than 2.7 million steel helmets. But perhaps more surprising, Ford, the auto manufacturer, built something with which they had virtually no experience at all. Frank Chiafone explained in a June 1973 edition of the Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute Press. In the summer of 1917, Henry Ford was invited to Washington by President Woodrow Wilson, who hoped to induce him to serve on the U.S. Shipping Board. The United States Shipping Board had been created in 1916 as an emergency agency tasked with increasing the number of U.S. ships that could support the war effort. It seems strange to ask Ford, surely a powerful and innovative industrialist, but one whose company had never produced so much as a canoe, to serve on the shipping board. But the board president, Edward Hurley, wanted to know if Ford's mass production techniques used to make automobiles could be applied to shipbuilding. It was an audacious idea. Ships are very different from cars, and shipyards include a lot of specialized skills and institutional knowledge that the Ford company simply didn't have. Ships had never been built in a factory anywhere in the world. And as a further problem, Secretary of the Navy Joe Daniels determined that there was no shipyard in the country available to make the ships. They were all already engaged in war business. So Ford offered not just to serve on the board, but to manufacture the vessels. Moreover, he recalled, one of the conditions precedent to their building was that their construction should not interfere with any other line of war production, and also that they be delivered quickly. Ford couldn't use any of his existing facilities or workers who were already engaged in war work. Chiafone explains. On 14 January 1918, Henry Ford agreed to build 100 to 500 Eagle boats, the first to be delivered in 5 months or less. The schedule called for 10 the following month, 20 the next, and 25 each month thereafter. A tentative price per ship was set at $275,000, and although the Navy considered this high, it placed the initial order for 100 ships on the same date. That is, over the course of a few months, a company with no shipbuilding experience whatsoever was expected to build a factory from scratch and manufacture more than 100 ships for the Navy using manufacturing processes never before used in shipbuilding. Ford wrote, surprisingly casually given the task, on December 22, 1917, I offered to build the boats for the Navy. The discussion terminated on January 15, 1918, when the Navy Department awarded the contract to the Ford Company. On July 11th, the first completed boat was launched. The boats were built on land that was previously undeveloped. The website of the Motor Cities National Heritage Area Partnership writes, Henry Ford began buying the property that was to become the Rouge in 1915, acquiring a 2,000-acre stretch of bottomland along the Rouge River. The Rouge River property still was not earmarked for any particular use, and Ford had even considered turning the land into a large bird sanctuary. Ford wrote, in 4 months, we ran up a building at the River Rouge, a third of a mile long, 350 feet wide, and 100 feet high, covering more than 13 acres. Cianflone writes, the ships were to sail from Detroit via the Great Lakes, the Erie Canal, the Hudson and Passaic Rivers to Newark Meadows, New Jersey, for fitting out. A plan that failed because, he writes, the New Jersey plant not being completed in time, the hulls were fitted at River Rouge plant and subsequently navigated the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River to the Atlantic coast. It turns out the boats would be both manufactured and fitted out at Rouge River in a manufacturing process that was entirely unprecedented. Ford wrote, these boats were not built by marine engineers. They were built simply by applying our production principles to a new product. Historian David A. Hounshell of Carnegie Mellon University wrote in the text Military Enterprise and Technological Change in 1983 that the construction of the River Rouge facility in about 4 months was a remarkable achievement. Likely as a reference to Bennett's Washington Post editorial, the boats were called Eagle boats. The boat design was produced by the Navy Department. Cianflone writes that Henry Ford's particular contribution to the design was limited to a suggestion that the Navy use steam turbines instead of reciprocating engines. He also suggested the use of flat hull plates so as to be able to take full advantage of mass production methods. At 200 feet long, the steel-hulled vessels were nearly twice as long as the wooden-hulled SC-1 class vessels. Cianflone explains, the original concept of size for a small ship grew with the addition of 4-inch 50-caliber broadside guns for fighting surface actions with U-boats, anti-aircraft guns, underwater listening devices designed by Edison, and extensive radio communication equipment. What started out to be a boat evolved into a ship, although the designation boat was retained. Hounshell writes that, assisted by Ford engineers, the Navy designed the Eagle for quantity production by an automobile manufacturer for mass production rather than construction by a shipbuilding firm. Consequently, in the place of smooth curves and rolled members were straight lines, flange plates, and structural angles. Cianflone notes that because of the box-like design and cramped quarters, the boats were nicknamed pickle boat or cheese box by the men who served in them. Coordination between the Navy and Ford could have been complicated, but the relationship was, Cianflone writes, admirably handled by Navy Lieutenant Julius Fuhrer, who would eventually reach the rank of Rear Admiral with the Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair. Construction was not as simple as manufacturing a Model T. Because of their size, the boats could not be moved along like the smooth assembly line, but rather would go through 7 assembly points and an additional pre-assembly station. Neither would they be able to be completed on the line, rolling off like Ford trucks ready to go, but would be fitted out after being launched with what Hounshell describes as techniques that bore little relationship to Ford's much-hailed work-in-motion or flow production methods. The construction ran into difficulties, especially with riveting, a skill not used in car production but vital to ships. Ford builders were first screwing plates together before riveting, but standing on ladders rather than scaffolds, they could not do so with sufficient pressure, and metal often got in between plates, and as a result, Hounshell writes, because of poor riveting, the Eagle boats were not watertight or oil-tight. The construction process was extraordinary in a number of ways. The hulls were built in the factory, and then, Hounshell explains, the transfer table, 202 feet long and supported on 11 railroad tracks, carried Eagle boats out of the assembly building and then moved them perpendicularly 300 to 600 feet away from the building into a position with the launching table. Once moved onto the launching table, Eagle boats were then lowered gently into the water by means of hydraulic jacks. But in the end, Henschel writes, the Eagle boat venture cannot be considered successful, either by the standards of the war era or the present. None of the Eagle boats was completed in time to see service in the war. Henschel explains, not until October 30th, 1918 was Eagle 1 commissioned. The last of the next dozen promised was not finished until mid-April 1919. At the end of 1918, more than a month after the armistice, Ford had delivered only 7 boats, and all of them had problems. Some members of Congress called for the project to be terminated. The Navy cut the order from 100 to 60. The 60th boat was not delivered until October 15th, 1919. In terms of performance, Cianfloni writes that there is some disagreement. While the boats had a reputation for difficult handling in rough seas, a reputation possibly driven by the sinking of Eagle 25 in a squall off of Delaware in 1920, reports suggested that they handled similarly to the period's 4-stacker destroyers. And in 1919, the commanding officer of the USS Eagle 1 stated that during the first 6 months of service, there were no defects in the hull fittings, and equipment of this vessel. The ship has been almost constantly underway since April 11th, 1919, serving mostly in Russian ice-covered waters. It speaks very well for the construction of these vessels that, in bucking heavy ice, no damage was experienced to the hull, frames, or bulkheads. Eagle boats 2 and 3 encountered the same conditions and handled equally well. It seems that after initial defects in production were remedied, the vessels were perfectly serviceable, with most serving into the 1930s and a few still in service during the Second World War. It was there, Cianfloni notes, that any Eagle boats really served the purpose for which they were built, and actively engaged in anti-submarine warfare operations. He writes, of the original 60, only 8 remained. They were assigned to anti-submarine warfare, sonar training, target towing vessels, and aerial bombing practice. None were given duty outside U.S. continental waters. Among those was Eagle 56, which on 28 June 1944, while patrolling off the Delaware Capes, suffered a catastrophic explosion. Only 13 of her crew of 62 survived the sinking. While originally the Navy concluded that the sinking was likely the result of a boiler accident, the discovery of the wreck in 2018 showed the boiler to be intact. In 2001, the Navy took the unprecedented step of overruling its own Board of Inquiry and ruled the sinking a combat loss, likely the result of a torpedo from submarine U-853.
The Ford Eagle patrol boats represented by any standard an astounding feat of engineering. Ford's efforts that allowed them to produce these vessels in less than 2 years, despite the fact that there wasn't even a factory built at the time that the contract was signed, is a testament to the nation's ability to meet war exigencies, even if the ships weren't exactly ready in time for the war. But in the end, Henschel notes, Ford's venture failed to revolutionize shipbuilding. Rather, he says, it pointed up the difficulty in transferring methods used to build high-volume consumer durables like automobiles to an area like shipbuilding. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.